Jeremiah chapter 1. We're actually going to be looking, deriving this from verse 6, but I'm going to read down through the first 9 verses. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests that were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. The word of God, came also in the days of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, unto the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, unto the carrying away of Jerusalem captive in the 5th month. Then the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Before thou camest forth of the womb, I sanctified thee. And I had ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. Then said I, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a child. But the Lord said unto me, Say not, I am a child, for thou shalt go to all that I shall send thee, and whatsoever I shall command thee, thou shalt speak. Be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee, saith the Lord. Then the Lord put forth his hand and touched my mouth. The Lord said unto me, Behold, I have put my words in thy mouth. Jeremiah. The last 40 years of the history of Judah and Jerusalem, his ministry, his season of prophetic utterance. And Jeremiah is basically a hospice worker. The nation is in decline. It will not revive. He is not called as a physician to restore health. He is called to be eyewitness to the decline and demise of Judah and Jerusalem, and to watch it slowly sink and perish before his eyes over a 40-year period. Through the reigns of 5 kings, 2 of them are not mentioned because they only had 3-month reigns. But he speaks about 80 years after the revivals under Isaiah and Hezekiah. He begins to speak under the reign of Josiah, who brings reform, but not revival, no heart change, though great reforms in the nation. And they fail. The nation is turned to sin, to idolatry, to vices that were the very reasons that God drove the Canaanites out of the land in the first place. Now, Judah and Jerusalem have come full turn and are as guilty as those Canaanites that God drove out. More guilty because of the light they had. The king, the court, the princes, the people, the priests, and the prophets, all given over. All guilty, worshiping Baal, Ashtart, Molech. It was an era that resembled our own. Zedekiah, the last king, would go to Jeremiah like he was interested in what he had to say, and then he'd go right back out and do something different. He would come and talk about God and then allow the children to be offered to Molech. And I am not talking about politics or parties. I'm talking about truth relative to Jeremiah's age. The king would talk about God and godliness in the temple and then promote immorality. The king would talk about God in the temple and worship and then let the sodomites have their way in the land. It was an era that was marked by decline and hypocrisy. And yet, the grace of God is put before us in that it said, the word of the Lord came. The word of the Lord came. To this generation, to this era, God, by his very nature, must warn, must challenge, must look for the individuals that are willing to turn. The word of the Lord came. It says, to whom the word of the Lord came, verse 2. Verse 4, the word of the Lord came unto me. As it says in John chapter 1, the light shone in the darkness, and the darkness apprehended it not. But God is always the same, never changes. Jeremiah was called, and I think we want to take note of his calling this week and his hesitancy in regards to that call. Next week, I want to look at the same verses, God's call in Jeremiah, and then God's affirmation of that very call. But I think we would be surprised at God's choice as we look at this. Jeremiah is called not from Jerusalem, not from the Mecca, but from Anathoth. 3 miles north, a small town where Abiathar the priest, who was of the lineage of Eli, who had failed, who had guarded the tabernacle under the days of Solomon, Abiathar and his family banned to Anathoth of the priestly line. He had Levi's blood in his veins, but not called from the Mecca, not called from the center of where you think that someone would be called in this situation. Not called from maturity, very important. Not called from maturity. Maturity certainly qualifies. So as we're older here today, you don't escape. But the point is, if you're younger, if you're 14, 15, 16, give ear. Because Jeremiah is somewhere between 17 and 22, somewhere in there. A youth, a child, he says. Not called from maturity, but called from youth. Not called from nobility. No natural qualification. Not mighty, not eloquent. He is timid. He's not like Isaiah. He's not like Ezekiel. He's not like Elijah. He is timid, and he is shrinking from the job that God is calling him to do, much different than what we would expect. But Paul tells us, for you see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh. Now, it doesn't say not any. He says, not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God hath chosen the foolish thing of the world to confound the wise. God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things that are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things that are despised hath God chosen, yea, and the things that are not, to bring to naught the things that are. There's a reason that no flesh should glory in his presence. He's calling Jeremiah unexpectedly. We wouldn't have surveyed the situation and pointed our finger at Jeremiah. We would think he would have passed over him. He's young, and that's what he doesn't say. It's not in the sense that I'm a baby. He says, Lord, I can't speak. I'm inexperienced. I'm not seasoned. How can I speak your word? How can I say these things? I'm a youth. It isn't just I can't speak because I'm a child. It's Lord, no one would listen to me. Lord, my age. Lord, my immaturity, even if it wasn't for his age. Lord, my inexperience. Lord, I'm not a public speaker. Lord, there's no reason that you would choose me, and there's no reason that anyone would listen to me. He's young. Well, he had some things going. He's from a priestly family. His father's name is Hilkiah, and there's a question mark, is it the same Hilkiah? And scholars differ in their view. But under Josiah, who was a godly king, there was a priest named Hilkiah who found a scroll of the Lord, and it was hidden in the temple. It was lost in the temple. It's much like today. If you look at the church in America, the word of God seems to be lost in the temple today too. But he found a scroll of the law, whether it was the first 5 books or whether it was just Deuteronomy, in the temple. This Hilkiah. That would make a man named Shallum his uncle, and it would make a woman named Huldah his aunt, who was the great prophetess under Josiah, who they brought to her the scroll, and she talked to Josiah about and told him. So maybe there were those influences in his life. Possibly. But he's young. And you can sit here today, look, God is going to have an influence on your life and speak to your heart and appeal to the deepest part of your being, which will never be at home in this world. Or our culture is going to speak to you in your youth and to the deepest part of your being about its morality, about playing its games, about being part of an entire generation that is sliding down the backside of the mountain. Our culture is going to speak to you if you're young, or God is going to speak to you. He's looking, his eyes go to and fro. He found Joseph, youngest among his brethren, as it were, except Benjamin, a youth, gave him a dream, so young, 16, 17, hated by his brothers because of his godliness, thrown into a pit, sold to the Midianite merchants, put on the auction block in Egypt, sold as a slave. Joseph ends up to be the second most powerful man on earth. Samuel, handed over as a small child by his mother Hannah to Eli the prophet, of the very line that it seems that Jeremiah came from. And as a small child, the Lord speaks to him. And he runs to Eli and says, "Master, did you call?" And he says, "No, go back to sleep, son." Again, as a child, he comes. Here's God's second time. "No, I didn't speak." And finally, Eli says, "Samuel, the next time you hear that, say, 'Speak, Lord. Thy servant heareth.'" A child. A child. God spoke to him. I've got a picture in my office of a first grader in Bill Gallatin's church in the Calvary Chapel up in Farmington. In fact, I should put it up on the overhead some week so you can see it. Several years ago, on September the 5th, the teachers in their Christian school told the first grade students, "We want you to draw a picture for your teacher this week and hand it in." On Friday, the 7th. And all of the kids, first graders, hand in pictures of rainbows and crosses and, what they do, Christian things, and "I love you, teacher so-and-so." One little kid hands in a picture, black and white, very strange. The teacher says, "What is this?" And I have a copy of it. He said, "I don't know." He said, "I had a dream last night, and then every time I went back to sleep, I kept dreaming the same thing, and it's all I could see, and it's all I could draw today." 2 tall buildings, people jumping out of the windows, planes crashing into the buildings. 4 days before it happened, 5 days before it happened. Little boy, first grade. A church with a cross at the bottom in front of it, the picture that was in Time magazine. I should give it, really, I need to every teacher in our school so they realize who's sitting in front of them. A child. David, a teenager, keeping the flocks. Samuel, looking for the king, going through all of the other brothers. Daniel, 13 or 14, when he's carried to Babylon, changes the course of the world, stands up at 13 or 14 without compromise in Babylon. John the Baptist, driven into the wilderness by the Spirit of God as a young boy. Timothy, let no man despise your youth. I'm young. We might have passed over him. Calvin, John Calvin wrote his Institutes when he was 24 years old. If you've ever read Calvin's Institutes, he was 24 years old. John Wesley, the revivals under him when he was 25. Whitfield changed the course of England when he was 22 years old. Charles Spurgeon began to preach when he was 16, and they moved him to London when he was 19 years old. And he was the talk of the town. I'm young. He was hesitant because of his youth. He was hesitant because of his nature. He was timid. He was sensitive. He's called the weeping prophet. He speaks of the heart 66 times in his prophecy. We learn more of Jeremiah because it's both a prophecy and an autobiography. He both speaks what God gives him to speak, and he feels it. He weeps throughout. He complained that his mother had brought him forth into an age of strife and contention. And yet we're told in the New Testament that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. He shrank from his message. It was judgment and woe. And he didn't want to preach it because he had to even condemn the priestly office and the prophetic office, of which he was both a priest and a prophet. And the priests and the prophets end up hating him because of his youth and because of his message against them. And serving as a prophet is always more difficult than serving as a priest. Priestly duties are predictable, and he was the son of a priest. Priestly duties are written out. The sacrifices are written out in the law. You can read them. Sacrifices for certain things, sacrifices for certain sins. To examine someone to tell whether they're unclean, a leper or whatever, and then they need to be outside the camp. To reinstate someone, all written out. How to celebrate the feasts and what are the rituals that go with the feasts. What all of the ordinances, all of those things are written out. Even the way they dressed. But a prophet had no such luxury. Never knew from day to day what God would have him say or where God would have him go. A priest preserved the tradition of the past, very strictly adhered to the things that were written out. A prophet rather sought to challenge the present that there might be a future. A priest dealt with externals, mostly ritual. The prophet was the one, and Jeremiah, so apt. The priest dealt with externals. The prophet sought to speak to the heart, where nobody wants to be spoken to when they're in sin. Priests rarely preached to multitudes or crowds unless it was a pronouncement or a prayer. The prophet spoke to the nation. Priests belonged to a specific tribe. They had a lineage. Their authority and their respect came from their birth and from their lineage. A prophet could be from any town, from any lineage, from anywhere, and his ministry had to be proven. Priests lived off the sacrifices and the offerings they were supported. Prophet, no guarantees. And he was a man that you and I would look at, and we probably know some young people in the church like this, and say they're timid, they're shy, they never want to do anything, they never want to go anywhere, they never want to extend themselves, never want to make themselves vulnerable. They're going to be better as an author sitting alone somewhere writing a book. They'll be better sitting behind a computer. This is not the kid. This kid would have a nervous breakdown if you ever stuck him up with a microphone in front of him. It's the one that God chose. It's the one that God chose. Timid, broken, heartfelt. In fact, Jesus would say to his disciples, "Whom do men say that I am?" He said, "Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist. Some say you're Jeremiah." Because of his passion and his brokenness and his tenderness, Jeremiah very esteemed amongst the prophets of Israel. But Lord, if I can't get away with being young and I can't get away with being bashful, how about this? I'm not a public speaker. Okay, we all got that down, don't we? You hear, you're a teenager. I'm not a public speaker. Can't do it, Lord. Ah, Lord God, behold, I can't speak. I'm a mere child. inexperienced, young. I'm no public speaker. I think of the Lord dealing with Moses at the burning bush, saying, I'm going to send you. And Moses saying, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since thou hast spoken to thy servant, but I am slow of speech and I am slow of tongue. I am glad that the Lord didn't listen to Moses. I can't do it. I'm not a public speaker. Slow of speech. I'm not eloquent. I can't do it. And the interesting thing is, of course, we're told by Stephen in Acts 7 that he was of great speech, that he was an orator, that he was the leader of the commander and chief of the Egyptian armed forces. But he ended up so broken, and he's 80 years old by the time he's realizing, I can't do this and of myself. Jeremiah 17 or 18 or 20, realizing I can't do this in and of myself. Isaiah, when God called him, would say, Woe is me, I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. I'm not a public speaker. I can't do this. I'm as sinful as anybody else. What right do I have to say anything to anyone? And Paul, of course, would say, my speech, my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom. He would say, who is sufficient for these things? I'm glad that Paul and Isaiah didn't turn away. Some things to take note of. I think the Lord here, as we look at this scene, simply asking for consecration, not ability. Are you available? That's the question he asks, not are you qualified. Are you available? 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 22, 24, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. Are you available? If not, that's between you and him. Are you available to this culture? Are you available to its standards? To its calling? Because it's calling so loud. It's calling so loud, the culture that we live in. You see the course of our nation and our world, and yet the word of the Lord comes. The word of the Lord comes, and it comes today. It hasn't changed. It doesn't need to be apologized for. It doesn't need to be customized to our day. The word of the Lord abides forever. And because God is gracious, it comes today. And God's eyes still go to and fro throughout the earth to look for those whose heart is perfect, that he might show himself strong on their behalf. What's your excuse? Too young, too bashful, could never do that. Not a public speaker, could never get up in front of anyone. That's not the question. None of that matters. Are you saying that God is not sufficient? That when God calls you, or you hear that throbbings on your heart, and then you're going to say to God, I'm too young, I'm really bashful and timid, I'm not a public speaker, and he's going to go, oh, good point. I'm just so desperate. I sometimes, God's calling is God's enabling. That will never change. Are you willing to go and to speak? Verse 7, the Lord said unto me, say not, I am a child, for thou shalt go to all that I shall send thee, and whatsoever I command thee, thou shalt speak. That's the question. Are we willing to go, and are we willing to speak? Don't tell me you're too young. I know who you are. I know what tribe you're from. I know your age. I know your heart. I know your timidity. I know your inexperience. None of that matters if I send you and if I give you the words to say? Are you willing? I'll give you peace. Verse 8, he says, be not afraid of their faces. And that's what people are afraid of. When they stand up, you look at, when we do our elementary school programs here at the church, I'm always tickled to watch, because I remember some of my kids when they were in that situation, they're up there, they're petrified. You see, some of them are they're natural. They're going to be on American Idol, someday. They're up there, but some of them are like, some of them are just moving their mouth. They're not even singing. They're looking around. Some of them are just petrified. They're just still. I had one like that. First grade. They're going to look at me. No, they're not. Yes, they are. Everybody's going to be looking at me. And I remember we went to the school program, and the whole class petrified. Just that one's mine right there. The whole time. Don't be afraid of their faces, God says. For I am with thee. I would rather know that than that I had 10,000 people with me. I am with thee. I'd rather be standing somewhere knowing he's with me than standing in a crowd trying to find security there. Be at peace. Don't be afraid of their faces, for I am with thee. And lastly, again, when he calls, he enables. Verse 9. Then the Lord put forth his hand and touched my mouth. Jeremiah amazed. And the Lord said unto me, behold, I have put my words in thy mouth. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. How? I don't know. Doesn't tell us. The word of the Lord came. We know that Isaiah saw visions. We know somehow how the prophets work. It doesn't tell us. The word of the Lord came. How? I don't know. You don't know. But every Jeremiah knows. Every Jeremiah and Jeremiah knows. Every boy, girl, man, woman, grandma, grandpa in this room knows when God speaks to them, because God knows how to speak to his children. And he treats us all differently, but it is clear to each of us and undeniable. It is not human language. He knows how we're made. He knows how we're woven together. And he knows how we hear. And he knows when we sit alone, how sometimes we're so touched and overwhelmed with his presence. And he knows how he brings something to bear upon our hearts. And he knows how inclined we are to say, Lord, I'm too young. Lord, I'm inexperienced. Lord, that's not my makeup. You've called other people to do that. I'm bashful. I'm no public speaker. So he takes a man named Jeremiah and he holds him up in our generation so that the word of the Lord might come again. Listen. Do we have 40 years left? I don't know. And anyone who God calls now, are you called to preach to a world in decline? I don't know. Probably. And will your own comrades possibly turn away? Maybe. Will it all be worth it? If it wouldn't, you wouldn't be up 8 o'clock in the morning here. Because eternity awaits us. eternity awaits us. God's calling. We're all able ministers of the New Testament. Every single one of us here custom made. Every single one of us here custom gifted. Some of us given 2 talents. Because the 2 talents we have will change the world that we live in. Some of us given 5 talents. Because we need 5 talents because we're not adequate enough to change the world with 2 talents, so we need more. Some of us 1 talent and will touch the world for Christ. All of us different, all of us custom made, but none of us disqualified by human standards. None of us disqualified by human standards. I hope there's a Deborah here, or an Esther, or a Spurgeon, or a Whitfield. I pray that there's 1 or 5 or a dozen that sit here today whose hearts resonate and say, Lord, with all of my heart, I want to serve you. With all of my heart, Lord, I want to be somebody for you. Can this be true? Can you be speaking to me, Lord? I am inexperienced. I am timid in my nature. I am not a public speaker. Is your word coming to me? Ask. Are you available? That's all he asks. Not are you qualified. His calling is his enabling, his enabling, his enabling, his enabling, his enabling, his enabling, his enabling.